right. Well, hello, welcome everyone. I'm Katie Cannon, the Curator of Education at the DAR Museum. So if you're not familiar with the museum, it was founded by the Daughters of the American Revolution to further their missions of historic preservation and education. The collection contains objects found in American houses from mostly the 1700s and 1800s. We do have a number of virtual events going on at the museum, including we have a new Secrets and Scandals tour for the month of October only, so please do go to our website and check that out. Today, though, we are focusing on historic clothing. And so we have one of our own lecturing today. Kara Bocek is the DAR Museum Shop Coordinator. She has also been making 1860s reproduction clothing for over 20 years. She earned a degree in anthropology from the College of William and Mary, where she also took costuming and patterning classes for fun. Then after several years doing archaeology, Kara decided to put her sewing skills to use and started her business, Corner Clothiers, which focuses on civilian men's clothing before and during the American Civil War. Her reproduction clothing and accessories are used at state and national parks across the country and appear in several productions on television and the big screen. So you may have seen some of Kara's work already and just not realized it. So Kara, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here virtually.
Yeah, all right. So I'm going to turn my my sound and video off, and we will turn the focus on over to you.
All right. Get started here in just a second. If you have any questions, you can put them in the question and answer box. I may or may not see them during the presentation. If it's a quick answer, I can, if a repeating of something, I can get to that while I'm going, hopefully. Otherwise, I will try to answer questions at the end. So we'll get started. If everybody can see the screen, start with tying it all together, a look at fashionable neckwear in the mid-19th century. And my goal when I was doing this research was for making reproductions of it. So I was trying to figure out how to make things, what to make, what would have been worn and used. So by the 1860s, photography was definitely a very big thing. And it's a great tool that we have accessible to us for seeing what was actually worn and not just what was suggested to be worn, but what was worn and how people were actually wearing it at a certain period in time. And I do have a variety of images, but a lot of my research has been done off of carte de visites, which are small little cards, but they were very affordable. So they weren't just available to the wealthy class, they were available to a wide range of people. So you're going to get more everyday type of styles and not just limited to one type of socioeconomic class. You are still missing certain things. You're missing enslaved people, you are missing the working class, you are missing laboring, but you do get a broad view of the everyday type of garments that people were wearing. So that's what a lot of my research has focused on for images, and then also using other things like the original garments, paintings, portraits, fashion plates to get other ideas to fill in the gaps that are missing from the photography. And so we're going to talk about a very narrow portion of fashion today, just neckwear for both men and women in the late 1850s, early 1860s. And a lot of this is going to be trying to answer questions that my customers came to me with. And for men's clothing, it's going to be who was wearing them, what ages were wearing, what type of people were wearing them. Were styles dictated by age? Like, am I too young to wear this? Am I too old to wear this style? What would be appropriate for what I'm doing? And what types of styles were popular? What do you see? What don't you see? So that's where that was my jumping off point for the research. We'll get to some women's stuff later because that's what I was wearing and that's what I needed to know for myself and also for some of my customers as well. So we'll start off with some earlier styles. These are both photographs from the 1850s. The gentleman on the left, he has just a very short ends on his tie here, a cravat. This would have been the earlier style where it's a rectangle or a square or a triangle that's been folded and then pressed, starched sometimes, and then this would be tied. And this is, in the 50s, it is starting to get narrow. It starts off really tall. If you think of like Mr. Darcy, Washington, all the Jane Austen movies, they've got the really tall cravats. They've got the collars that are sticking up high. The collars start to come down, and you don't have that space for that cravat anymore. So the cravats get more narrow and a little bit less bulky looking. But you do still see the same style that's been around for decades. You also see on the gentleman on the right, he's got long tails. His are much longer than the gentleman on the left. But he doesn't have anything vertical there. It's just the knot and then the tails hanging down. And his are untucked in this one. And here's a couple other versions of that same type of thing. This is a circa 1850 painting of William Sidney Mount. And so in paintings, you can start to see some of the colors, because black was obviously very popular, but you do see a lot of other colors in men's neckwear at this point. And as you can tell in this picture, or in the painting, there's color in the cravat and in his vest. Men's clothing is tending to get more dull colored for the coat and the trousers, but the vest and the cravat, you still see the pops of color and the personalization in them. So this could be tied as is, like we were talking about earlier, or it could be pre-made and then worn on a band, which is this original on the right is in my collection. It's very similar to the style being worn in the painting. It's got a metal band inside of it, and that springs open and closed, and then that would just go around your neck, and then you're done for the day. You don't have to worry about tying anything. His is worn tucked in, and I believe this one was made to be tucked in as well, because if you look at the bottom, it's the selvage edge. That's the edge of the fabric, which they used a lot to cut down on the labor, and then you don't have to worry about it fraying or anything, but that would be tucked inside the vest, so you wouldn't see that. This style of cravat, you often see, not always, but often see a piece of jewelry like a stick pin or other cravat pin down, holding those pieces together. And you also see sometimes where they have a little band that goes across and holds those tails together. And again, sometimes you'll see a little pin on there as well. So men were wearing jewelry as well as women. Here's a couple other styles. We've got kind of the two extremes here. By the 1860s, cravats are generally getting a little bit smaller, more narrow. This is a fairly average size here on the left, with a nice little stripe, got a little bit of the collar sticking up. But you do occasionally see some that go the other direction. It seems to be more of a fad. You don't see this much. And this is one of the few times where I would say this is a young man's fashion. In the late, I'm guessing it's like 1859, 1860, this seems to have been a fad where the bigger the cravat, the better. There's a published 2-year yearbook from a college in Tennessee, and about half of the young men in that yearbook have these giant cravats, and it's almost like the bigger the better. Sometimes they're like 3 inches or more tall and really, really wide. And again, there's a little bit of tinting on the center of his cravat, which could be a pin of some kind, or it could be embroidery or something. All right. And this could definitely have been tied as it was. And this one, I would guess, would be a pre-made where it's not being tied, it's on a band and would be fastened around the neck. Here's a couple more of that earlier style where you can see that it's been folded. And there's still a lot of volume there. Again, the ends are tucked into the vest. They're not hanging out. Even the ones that are a little bit longer, like the gentleman here in the center, the ends aren't visible. They're tucked into the vest. And these are all 1850s images. I don't have a location on any of these, unfortunately. But again, there's a wide range of ages with similar styles. We have a younger man here, an older gentleman, and again, a younger gentleman on the end. Here's a couple other examples. Again, a very typical 1860s. It's narrow, but it's long, and it has some little fringy ends on it here. So again, this wouldn't have been a triangle that would have been folded because you need to have a straight edge to have fringe on the end. It would have been woven that way. And then another image. This one's a little bit later, I think, and this one's Philadelphia and this one's Ohio, where you can see that little stick pin holding the different sides there together. And another question I frequently get asked is there a difference between the North and the South? Again, with my collection and looking at collections of friends, there's a lot more CDVs available from the North, but the ones that I have seen from the South are also very similar. I wouldn't have known that they were from the South unless I had seen the back mark on them. So it's going to be more of a, there's not really regional differences that I've been able to see in the styles that are worn for certain professions. Like it might be more, the difference in neckwear is going to be reliant on temperature, your environment, and what you're doing rather than where you are in the country. All right. And these three gentlemen look all very similar. They're all taken at the same photography studio in Pennsylvania, all around the same time period. And they're all about the same age, but they are wearing different styles of cravats. So again, region, they're all in the same region, they're all approximately the same age, but they're wearing different styles. We've got a very, on the left, very thin, short tie. It's not even the width of his face. In the middle, we have again that volume cravat that we see from earlier. And then again, on the right, we have the very thin, bold stripes on the diagonal and more length to it. So they were all living, they might have known each other, they might have been friends, we don't know, but they were all from the same area getting their picture taken at the same time, wearing a variety of different styles. A couple more of that early style with the cravat. And again, ends are tucked in, they're not hanging out. Both of these are early 60s. The gentleman on the left is from Philadelphia. The two gentlemen on the right are a little bit later in the 1860s or possibly even early 1870s. The gentleman on the left, I'm pretty sure after looking at this image a bit more that this is a copy of an earlier photograph. But again, there's not much volume in this. It's more thin and compact rather than the big volume, which you start to see more in the late 50s and early 1860s. Again, we've got fringed ends on some of them, a little bit of the bow, and then the ends are wider, or sometimes the ends are just straight out. And I believe all of these, none of those have back marks on them, so I don't know where they're from. Now, people are always asking, what colors are good? Black. You cannot go wrong with black. Black's all over the place, but they did have the technology for colors. Colors are everywhere. After the lecture, if you want to take a look at the DAR Museum's collection, you can see some original dresses and some men's vests that have bright colors in them, so that while all the pictures that we're looking at today are kind of dull, the original garments that they were wearing in them are not dull. Stripes were very, very popular. They can go either lengthwise or the short way on the cravat. You see both. You see even stripes. You see widely spaced stripes. Again, both of these are very crisp, so they're probably and thin. And this one on the left, I would guess, would probably be a ribbon tie. And the one on the right looks like it's made out of silk to me. Both earlier mid-60s, this guy's a little bit later, probably 64 or later. Some more patterns that I've seen. And again, we don't know what colors they were. They could be shades of black. They could have color to them. The gentleman here on the right has some chevrons. He's definitely a little bit later in the 1860s. And then the gentleman here on the left, there's something going on in the ends here. I can't quite tell what it is. Sometimes you can see embroidery on them. And there are instructions in some of the ladies' magazines for doing embroidery. Usually it's on the women's ones, but you see it on some of the men's neckties as well. Plaids aren't as common in the men's as they are in women's. Stripes seem to be more popular than plaids, though there could be plaids reading as stripes, given the photography of the era. So, and also you see polka dots, polka spots, other patterns, checks, plaids. The gentleman on the left here, it looks like polka dots. It could be a check that's reading as a polka dot. One of the originals that a friend lent me, it's all black. It's got a double layer bow on the pre-tied part. And then the top part of it looks like it has little polka dots on it. I thought it was woven that way and it was two different fabrics, but looking at it closer, it's the same fabric as the rest of it. Somebody took and sewed little spots on it. So it's coming up, there's white thread coming up over a few of the black threads and then skipping on the back to make it into a polka dot on just that one part, which I thought was kind of interesting. But you see some colors in the polka dots as well, more than just black and white. And then on the right, here's the long ends that overlap each other again with a little pin that holds them together. So you see patterns on multiple different styles. So it's not like the style with the knot and the long tails is just plain. You see prints and stripes and things on different styles as well. Though again, probably plain is the most common across the board. But there's definitely other options. By the 1860s, the stock has kind of gone out of fashion, but you do still see them occasionally, as we can see in this gentleman here. The one on the left is from the DAR collection. You can see it's got quite a bit of width to it. It fastens with a buckle, and this one has a lovely little blue and white check pattern to it. Whereas the gentleman on the right in the image, he is probably wearing a black silk satin, and his has a little bow attached to it as well, which you see sometimes. Sometimes there's also additional folds of fabric on here so that it looks like it's been wrapped around the neck and it's not just the plain stock. And I've seen these in, again, a variety of colors. I've seen other blue ones with checks on them. There's a beautiful pink and green plaid up at Genesee Village that is definitely not plain or subtle. So again, kind of going out of fashion in the 60s, but they are still around because this is definitely a well-dressed man. Oops. And before we move on to the women's things, just a few things to wrap up with the men. Out of all of my images, I have hundreds of these now, and I have friends that have thousands of images, and I've been allowed to look through those as well. Almost every single man is wearing something at his neck. I have one example out of probably 700 or 800. That isn't an occupational where the gentleman does not have something at his neck. Somebody asking me what the difference between a stock and a cravat is. Terms are very fluid, but in general, the stock has more structure to it. Whereas on this example from the DAR, it's shaping and it's more elongated and it's stiffer. This cravat tends to be more like a floppy part that you tie and isn't buckled on, but you see terms, very fluid definitions to them, which makes doing some of the research kind of difficult sometimes. You see things that you would definitely call a stock at some point, but they're calling it a cravat and vice versa. So terms can be fluid, unfortunately. All right, so that's a brief overview of some gentlemen's neckwear fashions. Before we move on though, one of the things that I see a lot, or one of the things that I've gathered from this is that men's neckwear, when it's got a lot of volume to it, going horizontally across the neck, you got the big bow, it doesn't tend to have a large, long volume coming down. The tails aren't long and big. It's not like a wreath or a Christmas bow on a wreath. It's either one or the other. You do see sometimes the big neck bow or the big bow, and there might be some little tails coming down, but not the big massive. So it's a lot more constrained, more neat, rather than just kind of floofy all over the place. All right, so moving on to some women's neckwear. A lot of the same questions I get with that is, who was wearing them? Am I too old for this style? Am I too young for this style? Am I too poor for this style? Am I too rich for this style? Can I wear that with this dress? Can I wear it with that dress? When can I wear this? And again, looking through my collection and through a couple other published collections, I did some counting and data collection. And in those 3 collections that I had looked at, it was about 30% of the women were wearing a necktie of some kind. In this era, women almost universally were wearing a white collar at the neckline. Again, there's a few variations here and there, but it's by and large, that was one of the finishing touches, was you to have a nice, neat white collar. And by the 1860s, it's gotten fairly narrow. You don't see the big, wide collars of the 1850s. And then there's something that, again, like with the men, you don't see men without cravats or neckties. You don't see women without the collar or with something that ties that all together, finishing that up. It's often a brooch of some kind, but it could also be a necktie. And about 30% of the time in the images, it's a necktie. So they're not uncommon at all. And again, going through the multiple images in my collection and other people's collections that they have lent to me, you see a wide range of ages. It's not a young person's thing, it's not an old person's thing. You see the same style being worn across different ages, as you can see in the photographs over here. Very similar style, though the lady on the left is slightly more unusual. I have a feeling that this one is actually tied, whereas the other one is constructed. Most of the ladies' neckties aren't just a ribbon that's tied and tacked on. You do see that occasionally, but it's much more often to see a constructed bow that is then attached to the dress in some way. So I asked if there was a purpose to wearing or simply fashion. As far as I know, it's simply fashion. It doesn't keep the dress on. It doesn't add any, it's just a fashion thing. It might be a holdover from some earlier thing, but in general, I don't know any reason, any function for having that. There's a function to the white collar that helps to keep your dress clean because you're not washing your dress every day. You can take your collar off and wash that. So there's that type of protection aspect to the collar, but as for the brooch and the necktie, nothing that I am currently aware of for a function for it. And again, even with just these two images, you can see a variety in the ages, in the styles of dresses. The older lady on the left is wearing a fancy dress with lots of trim. The girl on the right is wearing a simpler dress with a print on it. Darted bodice on the left, gathered bodice on the right. So you see a lot of variation, and it's not tied to this type of bow is worn with this type of dress. You see a lot of fluidity in what is worn with what. Again, suitable for any age. These three images are all from the same photographer in Rhode Island, and they're probably all from the same family. A couple of them have names on the back. They all came together, and I believe they're all from the same family. So this could even be 3 generations of women, again, wearing a variety of style of dresses, but similar styles of neckties for the ladies. And also for the ladies, they are called a necktie or a cravat. Same type of terminology that you get with the men. So even within here, you can see some variation within the basic same style though. I'm guessing the one in the middle here is velvet. And you see the one on the right is very likely a ribbon. You see this where it's dark in the center and then it has light edges. That is probably the most common style of ribbon necktie that I've seen for women. It is all over the place. It's in a variety of widths. This one's a little different than some of the other ones we'll see later on here. And again, it's not that these women couldn't afford a brooch. They have made the choice to wear it because the lady in the middle has a very nice dress. She has a watch tucked into her belt here. She's got a nice little buckle on. These are not people that can't afford jewelry. They are well off. Moving on to common styles for the women. Again, like with the men, you see just the straight bow going across, which is very popular and in a variety of widths. And here's that ribbon again, where it's dark in the center with the 2 light edges. Again, very common style. And again, it doesn't really matter what type of dress it is. Again, on the left, we have a very simple gathered bodice. Could be a nice wool, could be cotton. On the right, pretty safe guess that she's wearing silk here with very fancy decorated sleeves. So again, similar style can go with a lot of different dresses. And for the edges, a little hard to see, but they're often cut straight or on a diagonal. You don't see like the dovetail cut or a point on the ribbon styles. It's just cut. And the first lady that we saw, and which I've seen in a couple other images, they didn't hem them, and you can see that they're starting to fray a little bit. So either it wasn't an issue or they didn't notice it in the photographs. So sometimes I think we're a little too persnickety about how things get finished. Another style of bow looks very similar. And again, these are constructed, not tied the way that the straight bows are done too. They just have tails added onto them. And they come in a variety of lengths, and again, variety of widths. But the tails can be somewhat short, like the lady here on the right. They come down just to above the chest area, or they can go down past the break in the bust. But you don't usually see them going all the way down to the waist. So kind of a mid-length, but there is some range in there. So if you only have a certain yardage for a ribbon, you can make it work. It doesn't have to be a certain length. And again, cut on the diagonal or cut on a straight edge. Another style that I saw, which I wouldn't have thought of, but once I started doing the research, it started popping up more and more, are very thin ribbons. Sometimes they're obviously velvet. Sometimes there's something else where there's lots of little bows all kind of lumped together, and then they have a couple of long strings coming down them. So it's kind of like a little poof at the neck. which is very obvious in the one on the left. On the right, you can kind of see it, but not very well, but it's very similar in style. And again, you can't tell colors from CDVs all the time. You can get some general ideas, but you can obviously see that there's more than just dark colors. You can wear a variety of colors and shades. And the one on the right is from 1865, I believe. Some of these are, it's handy, they have dates written on the back of them. And then the lady on the left is from the early 1860s, and they're both from Pennsylvania. One's from Philly. The one on the right's from Philly. The one on the left is from Bloomsburg. Some other styles, we see multiple loops, which again, isn't something that could be tied. It has to be constructed. And sometimes they're very neat. And there's another little bow hidden under the edge on the lady on the left here. You see multiple loops, but you'll still just usually see two ends coming out. And oftentimes, like, I would tend to put the ends coming down, but they often go in the middle, or they go up as far as the constructed bow goes, which you can see on the right here. Like, these are loops here on the bottom, and then that's an end, and then that's an end there. They stick out a little bit further. And just like with the men, the women, they didn't have to wear just the bow or just a cravat or just a brooch. You could wear them together, which is what you see on the lady on the right here. She's got a tiny little pin or brooch or something on top of her bow, holding it together there. And I think these are largely Pennsylvania ladies again too. Yep. The two on the left and the center are from Philadelphia. The lady on the far left is from, her picture was taken in 1864 in May. It's dated on the stamp on the back. And the lady on the far right is from Bordentown, New Jersey. The ribbon is not attached to the collar, it's separate. A little bit later on, we'll get to how they were attached and worn. And women, there's lots of instructions in fashion magazines on how to make neckties for ladies. So while men's stuff is very easy to be bought, ready-made, women's stuff is still made at home a lot. So I'm sure you could buy them, but a lot of times it is something personal being made at home, which might attend to the messiness of some of these, or the thrown together looking nature of some of them, or it might have just been the fashion. Here's a couple less common styles that I've seen. Where it's visible all the way around the neck. It's not hiding under a collar, or there's a standing collar, as in the woman on the left here. This was taken in 1863 in Philadelphia, and that's a rather wide stand-up collar for what I've normally seen, but it's dated 1863. And again, she's wearing a brooch on the front of it. I'm thinking it could be a cameo, or it could be a photograph, or it's what I'm leaning towards. And again, long ties coming down. And then the lady on the right here is one of the more unusual ones that I've seen. Is she's got a slight V-neck, which you do see that occasionally. Usually it's just a rounded neckline. I can't tell if she's got a collar on or not. Like, I can't tell if that's her neck up there, or if there is a very narrow collar and this is going over it. And it looks to be just lapped over and possibly pinned in the center. I'm not seeing anything that looks tied there. So that's definitely a less common style, but you do see some stuff like that occasionally where they're just lapped over. And not to get too off topic here, but she has an off-center part, which again is not very common. Generally it's straight center part, but you do occasionally see the off-center part for some reason. The reason I have so many pictures from Philadelphia is, well, I lived in Gettysburg, and I'm currently in Maryland. So there's a lot from the area here. There's also a lot of photographers who are working in Philadelphia. And I happened on a large lot of photographs for a really good price. And so I have a lot from Philadelphia. There was like 500 or so from Philadelphia. So my collection is a little skewed towards Philly, which is why I am so lucky to have so many other friends that have collections across the country that are willing to let me use them so that I'm not totally biased towards Philly. Because I do have images from Oregon, California, Missouri, Ohio, Michigan. It's just a lot of the really good examples happen to be from Philly. All right, so moving from the still slightly less common, but less common because they're fancier. This lovely lady is again from Philadelphia, I believe. Yep. And again, going back to the, she could afford a brooch. I'm sure she has several, but she just isn't wearing it with this dress. You see a lot of, you do see fancy bows, and they're sometimes even labeled that, fancy neckties in the ladies' fashion magazines, and there's instructions and patterns for how to sew them and put them together and how to decorate them. You know. This one, I'm kind of curious as to if the ends of the bow might match the trim on her dress. Can't really tell, but I wouldn't be surprised if it does. But these little white dots on here, it could be embroidery or it could be beads. I'm leaning towards beads because you do see that mentioned in a lot of the magazines. It could also be some braid work here on the end, like soutache or braid, just braiding, cording that would be stitched down in patterns. I like her, she's pretty. Some other fancier styles are lace, which you tend to see a lot of lace at the neck in the 1870s and into the 80s when things get like the really big hair, the really big jewelry, and lots of floofy lace at the neck. You do still see it in the 50s and the 60s. Earlier, it seems to be just like simple pieces that are lapped over each other. But you do see some somewhat constructed bow or neckties with lace on them. You can see the detail pretty well on the lady here on the left. She's from New York, so we're close to Philly, but we're not actually in it anymore. The two on the left are both from Philadelphia, and the one on the top, her name is something Boyer, and she was photographed July 22nd, 1862. Has that nice wide early hairstyle. She got some beautiful little earrings on there. She got lace at the neck, and it's all held together with a little brooch, which I'm guessing is a coral branch. Like it would have a gold circle and then the branch coral in the middle of it. I think we have some of those in the collection at the DAR as well. And then the lady in the bottom right is Mary Bethel, I think. And she was photographed July 7th, 1865. So you can see the difference in the hairstyles, but they're still both wearing lace at the neck and a brooch holding them together there. And this is one of my first CDVs that I picked up because of the neck of her cravat. It's colored. Sometimes the coloring doesn't make any sense, but on this one, it makes sense. It's just on her neck bow there. This has some of that braiding again at the bottom. And at first I thought this was fringe, but after a closer look, I believe this is lace here on the edge. So again, constructed, each piece at the top, each side of the bow would be a separate piece, each tail would be a separate piece, and then separate piece here holding it together. A lovely side picture where you can see her hair in there too, and you can see the scalloped edge on the collar here. And this reminds me of one of the printed directions that I had seen here. Reminds me of this one on the top right. It's very similar. It's a simpler braiding style on it. But the one here on the top left is from 1852 in Godey's, and it is pink velvet with white embroidery with chenille and silver cord, and is lined with white silk. So it's got white chenille embroidery and a buttonhole stitch around the edge, and then it's got silver cording crocheted around the outside and then stitched on for the veins in the leaves. That's a lot of work. I haven't seen one of these in a photograph. I've seen several men's that look like they might have something embroidered on that center part of the knot, which makes me think that they are constructed rather than tied, because you'd have to be very, very careful to get that one embroidered spot in exactly the right place every time. The one here on the bottom left is from 1861. It says it's velvet with embroidered ends. That one doesn't give a color, so it could be black or it could have a color to it. And a lot of these did originally appear in European publications, and then they made it to America a couple months later, which there's other examples of that later on. And there's a lot of stealing or sharing going on, where one magazine publishes it and then a couple months later then another magazine publishes it, where they've changed a few things. They changed the color or they changed the stitch pattern or something, but it's the exact same engraving. And so this is where we start talking about some colors. We said this first one is pink. The one over here on the top right, this is also from 1861. It's a green silk with gold braid and black lace. So that's some bright colors there. The one on the bottom right is from that same publication, cherry silk, gold braid, and gold beads, which is kind of hard to see. They're in little trios above the braiding here. So again, it would be a bright red with gold accents on it. So there's color. And this picture is from the Dar collection and goes back to the how is it worn? How is it attached? In the previous picture, it talks about necktie of green silk, the part going under the collar cut to fit the neck. So the bow is constructed and attached to a band that goes around the neck. Of course, it doesn't tell you how the band is closed. I'm guessing it's closed with straight pins, but you could have put a button on there or something as well. And I think what you're seeing here under her collar, which is, it's not lace, it's embroidery on glace, something close to that pronunciation, which is worked holes with thread around them through it. And you can see a little bit possibly peeking out underneath the collar. So that might be what's going on here. This lovely little tinted red, pink with black lace around the edges of it. And again, another brooch attached on the front of it. I've also seen an original dress that still has the necktie attached to it. It's just been tacked on one side, and then when the dress is put on, I would assume it would have like either another tacking stitch put on so that it would stay closed, or a straight pin cut through it, put through it. I usually just use a couple of straight pins to attach them to the top of my dress. Occasionally I've lost a straight pin, but I have yet to have lost a cravat off of my dress. And I haven't stuck myself either. You stick the pins back into the tie, and then it doesn't scratch you. And it stays on sturdy. So there's lots of options for how they would be attached to the dress. And they could be worn on multiple dresses. It could have been designed to be worn with a dress, and it could have been worn just briefly. Again, you've put some work into it, but it could be for the season. So you wear it for the season and then you don't wear it anymore. Ladies' neckties, I haven't seen originals of the way I have with men. That could be that I'm looking, because I've largely been looking for the men's neckwear in originals to see construction. But it's also a lot easier for the women's stuff to be reused for something else. If the bow can be taken off the dress, taken off the band, and moved on to something else and reused. Earrings. Somebody was asking about earrings. They are not uncommon at all. You see, again, once you start looking for them or you start seeing them, they are more common than you might have originally thought. Sometimes they're big and dangly, sometimes they're a little bit smaller, they're gold, they're made out of semi-precious stones, gutta percha, jet. You see a lot of different styles, and you see a lot more jewelry in images than I originally thought I would be seeing. See lots of belts with buckles or not with buckles, bracelets, earrings, necklaces, a bit. Earrings and finger rings are probably the two most common that you see, in watch chains, which is what she has coming off her front here. This is a watch chain there. And it goes down to her watch and her belt. She's also got some little wristlets on that have some kind of design on them. All right, moving on to, we saw her, she had a bow and a belt. They didn't match, but sometimes they did match. You have sets, and again, these are what's being advertised or put out in the fashion magazines. Whether they were actually made and worn, who knows, but they were what was being touted as fashionable. We have a lot of, again, fancy tie and cuff. Some of these specifically say that the cuff is to be worn over gauntlets or over gloves, and not just on the dress. The one on the top is from 1862 in Godey's. The one on the bottom left was originally published in Der Bazaar in 1861, so that's Germany, or what is now Germany. And then the following year, it showed up in Peterson's, but with less detail as to how to make it or what it consists of. Like each one of these is a different little leaf petal, and I think there's 3 different shades of pink that they want you to do on here, and then the base is velvet. So again, color. On the right, on the lower side, this one is another one that was copied. This is from La Mode, and then it shows up in 1861 in Godey's. And this is a red silk with black velvet ribbon, gold beads, and lace. And the picture on the top here is my reproduction of that image. I might have gotten the scale of it a little long. It ended up a little big, but again, that's what they were doing at the time too, was interpreting the pictures and seeing what worked for their size and their body type and their dress style. I haven't attempted the cuffs yet because they're a little strange to me, but maybe someday. You see a lot of red, black, and gold in the magazines for suggested colors. So don't be afraid of colors, and don't think that everything in the pictures is black, because red often photographs dark, so what you think is black could actually be red. I like this set, and I really want to try making this at some point because I really like the scale of it. And this is a necktie of scarlet silk with black velvet and braiding of gold. So it's red background, black velvet, and gold loopies on top of it. In the same magazine on different pages, they also include a fancy belt and cuffs, again to be worn over gloves. The descriptions on these don't match the descriptions on the necktie. So they're obviously the same pattern, but they give you different options. The belt is to be made of black or any fancy colored silk, black velvet, and gold braid, with a handsome gold buckle. And the gauntlet says that it's black silk, black velvet, and gold braiding. It goes with a little button up here as well. Now, did anybody actually make these? Who knows? But we do see some matching styles in maybe a little bit simpler styles, but you do see cravats, ladies' cravats, and belts that match. There's a little fold over here that's very similar to the fold over in her necktie. It might be a slight different in widths in here, so it might just be similar, might not be exactly the same, but you do see that showing up in photographs as well. And neither of these have a back mark, so I'm not exactly sure where they're from, but they're fairly solidly early 1860s based on the shapes of skirts and sleeves and things. All right, and that is our last image. Brings us to just a wrap up for the women's. In general, they're fairly narrow, 1 to 2 inches wide in silk fabric that's been constructed or ribbon that's been constructed. If it's narrower than that, like 1/2 inch or so, it's going to be a cluster of loops. The bow size is usually going to be less than the width of the face. Sometimes the tails end up longer, but the bow itself is less than the width of the face, not the shoulder to shoulder. The tails of bows can, if the bow has tails, they can be short or they can be fairly long, but generally not down to the waist. Usually it's a couple inches above the waist is the longest that I've seen. The ribbon necktie ends are cut on a straight edge or cut on a diagonal. You don't see any shaping other than that on the edges of those. And most bows are constructed, and that's where you start to see some of the points and the fancier ends on things are on the constructed bows, where they're from fabric rather than ribbons. And that brings me to the end of the photographs. So if anybody has any other questions, you can type them into the question and answer. And stop sharing my screen so I can see you all again. All right, back to men's. When stocks came into fashion. Oh, they're very early. They go back into at least the 18th century for stocks, which I haven't done research back that early much. So I can't give you an exact date on that, but it starts, I believe they start out as like a military thing, but I could be wrong on that. The example from the late 40s, yes, they were, some of them were originally made from leather. Again, the military ones, I believe, were made from leather. But by the 1850s and 60s, you don't really see much leather in neckwear for men. At least not for a fashionable everyday type of wear. It's mostly going to be silks for fashionable neckwear. You don't really see much besides silk. Anything else? Oh, did husband and wives ever coordinate? Not that I've noticed. A lot of it's because of the different fabrics that are used, I think. I'm not saying it never happened, but it's not something that I've really noticed. There's one picture in the book, Dressed for the Photographer, where there's 2 men next to each other, and they look like they split a set of clothing because like it's one guy's vest and trousers match, but they're on this separate gentleman, and then the guy wearing the trousers, it looks like their cravat matches, but that also kind of doesn't make sense because you don't really see that out of wool very much. But anyway. All right, Thomas Shaw answered that yes, the army was still issuing leather stocks, but I don't really do much with military stuff, so I hadn't looked into that. Late transition to today's regular men's ties and bow ties. You still see what, like the cravat necktie, what we might consider a bow tie, carries on through the late 19th century. You do start to see more of the longer ties coming out in the mid to late 60s, but just the bow tie type style seems to be more popular until later in the century. Were children dressed in a similar manner? I haven't done a lot of research on children's stuff, but when children are starting to dress like adults, they are wearing similar. Oh, one image I did not get a chance to put into the presentation is a 4-generation photograph. And while any age could wear any style of necktie, you do tend to see in this image, the older gentleman is wearing the wider cravat. Then we see, again, still wide, but a little bit less bulky. And then this smaller 1860s, and then the little boy has just a little bit that you can see in between his coat there. And for girls, again, very similar styles in when they're wearing young ladies' dresses. But as far as younger children, I'm not sure. I haven't looked into that. There's so many different things to research that I haven't gone down that rabbit hole yet. Any other questions? Oh, yes, definitely get out there and look at those family photos. You never know what you might see and what you start noticing once you know that they exist and what to look for. I guess we're just about at an hour here, so unless there's any other questions, we can look at it. Make sure you check out the DAR's online catalog for more examples to look at in the photographs. And since I work at the shop, I got to plug the shop. If you want to stop and see what we've got there, we've nothing really related to neckties, but got some great items there. It's shop.dar.org. Also, you can find it linked from our website. Thank you all for coming. Hope you enjoyed it.